For most of my life, people looked at me and thought they saw serenity. They saw a woman clothed in black and white, kneeling quietly in prayer, lips moving softly in hymns, hands folded as though untouched by the storms of the world. They believed my silence was a choice of discipline, an offering to God. But silence is not always holy. Sometimes silence is survival, and sometimes silence is a wound that never healed. There are moments when you convince yourself that if you never speak about the past, it will eventually disappear. You tell yourself that what is buried cannot harm you anymore, but secrets are never truly buried. They live inside you, pressing against your chest in the middle of the night, reminding you with every breath that they are still there. I carried such a secret, one so heavy that it bent my back long before age did. For years I never let anyone see the truth. I smiled when expected. I prayed when asked. I fulfilled my duties in the convent with devotion. Yet behind the veil, behind the rosary beads that swung gently against my side, there lived a story that I never told. Not to my fellow sisters, not even to those who loved me most. A story that began in the innocence of childhood, when I still believed that every adult was meant to protect me, and that every family bond was sacred. It has taken me decades to gather the courage to open this wound, and even now, my hands tremble as I allow these words to leave the prison of my lips. But I know this: if I remain silent until my last breath, then the darkness that once consumed me will have won. I speak now because I believe there is someone out there who needs to hear this, someone who thinks their silence must last forever. To that soul, I say, there is another way. My name is Vivian Caraway. I am a nun, a woman who has spent a lifetime in service of God, cloaked in devotion. But before the convent, before the candles and the psalms, I was just a little girl who trusted the wrong person. And it was that trust, misplaced and manipulated, that nearly destroyed me. I was born in a quiet corner of America, in a house filled with laughter that slowly grew colder with time. As a child, I was taught to believe in the goodness of family, to respect my elders, to obey without question. Among them was a man who should have been my protector, someone others in my family praised as hardworking and dependable. He was my uncle. To the world, he was generous, the kind who remembered birthdays and told jokes at gatherings. To me, in the earliest years, he seemed safe. I never imagined that safety would turn to dread. But I must not get ahead of myself. The path to understanding is a slow one, and my story is not only about the darkness, it is about how light still found me when I thought it never could. It is about how God sometimes sends miracles in human form, how a hand extended at the right moment can break chains that have bound a soul for too long. Yet to appreciate the miracle, you must first understand the prison. I remember sitting in church as a little girl, watching sunlight fall through stained glass, painting the pews in colors of crimson and gold. The hymns lifted around me like wings, and I thought the world was pure. I believed that if I kept my head bowed and my prayers strong, nothing bad could ever happen. I believed the people I loved would always protect me. I believed I was safe. How naive those beliefs now sound when spoken aloud. The first shadows fell quietly. There was no thunder, no warning. It began with small moments, the kind that could be dismissed by anyone on the outside. A hand lingering too long on my shoulder. A door closed a little too firmly when no one else was home. Words spoken in a tone I did not yet understand, but that made my stomach twist in ways I could not name. I was only a child, and children rarely see danger in those they are told to trust. Still, something inside me knew. I felt it when I prayed at night, clutching the little cross above my bed, whispering words to God that I did not fully understand. Please, please keep me safe. But the silence of heaven felt like the silence of my home, thick, unbroken, suffocating. And in that silence, I learned how easily innocence can be stolen, not with noise, but with quiet persistence. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what my face looked like in those days. Did my eyes already show the shadow of what was happening? Did my smile falter more often than it should have for a girl my age? Or did I still manage to fool the world, just as I fooled myself? Because that is what silence does. It teaches you to lie even when no words leave your mouth. For a long time, I believed the lie. I believed I was the problem, that if I were more obedient, more careful, more invisible, none of it would happen. I believed that my silence was protecting my family, that to speak would only bring destruction. And so I stayed quiet, carrying a secret that grew heavier with every passing day. But silence is not strength. It eats at you slowly until you are nothing more than a shadow walking through life. That is what I became, a shadow in my own home, a ghost that no one saw, even though I was right there before them. Years later, when I put on the veil, people thought my silence was a holy choice. They thought it was prayerful discipline. They could not see that my silence had been born long before the convent. They could not know that my vow of quiet was only a continuation of the prison I had already lived in. And so here I am, speaking now for the first time, peeling back the veil, not of cloth, but of secrecy. This is my story, the story of how my uncle used my trust in silence, how my family looked the other way, and how the God I once thought had abandoned me sent a miracle that changed everything. This is not an easy story to tell, but I believe that in the telling there is healing. And maybe, just maybe, someone listening will find the courage to break their own silence. Before the silence, before the shadows, there was a season of light. I often return to those early memories, not because they were perfect, but because they remind me of who I was before fear carved itself into my bones. Childhood, to me, was the hum of cicadas in the summer air, the clinking of dishes in my mother's kitchen, and the faint glow of candles flickering in our parish church on Sunday mornings. I was a lively girl once. I laughed too loudly, sang off-key, and often pretended the small backyard was a grand stage where I would recite little verses of prayer as if I were already a grown woman in the church. My parents, hard-working and often tired, still tried to make space for joy. My mother baked bread on Saturdays, filling the house with a smell that wrapped around me like a blanket. My father worked long hours, but returned home with stories that painted him as larger than life in my young eyes. And then there was my uncle. In those days, his presence was unremarkable, even comforting. He was my father's younger brother, a man who lived nearby and visited often. To the outside world, he was kind, reliable, the one who fixed broken chairs, the one who brought sweets for the children, the one who carried heavy boxes so my mother wouldn't strain herself. People admired him for his strength and humor. He was the man who made others laugh at family gatherings, whose voice filled the room with stories of work and travel. To me, as a child, he seemed safe. Another adult I was told to respect, another pair of hands I could trust. I remember one spring afternoon when the world still felt simple. I was no more than 8, sitting on the porch with a book too difficult for me to understand. My uncle passed by, whistling a tune, and stopped to ruffle my hair. "Smart girl," he said, "always with a book." I looked up, smiling, not yet recognizing how words could carry a weight deeper than their sound. It was one of countless interactions that seemed ordinary, but when I look back now, I can see the early seeds of closeness he planted, the kind that blurred boundaries without ever being questioned. Faith was the center of our lives. Each Sunday, our family filled a pew near the front of the church. Sunlight poured through stained glass, scattering color across the floor as the choir's voices rose like wings. I sat with folded hands, watching my mother bow her head in reverence, watching my father's lips move with certainty as he recited every prayer. My uncle was often there too, his head bowed, his voice deep and confident. If there is a cruelty sharper than betrayal, it is seeing the hands that once held a rosary become the same hands that would later bind you in fear. In those innocent years, I thought safety was guaranteed by family ties. I believed that every adult in my world existed to protect me. When I scraped my knees, my father lifted me onto his lap, wiped away the tears and said, "You'll be all right, Princess." When I burned my tongue on hot soup, my mother blew gently on the spoon and smiled. "Patience, my dear." When my uncle carried me on his shoulders during town parades, I waved to the crowd believing I was untouchable. I did not yet understand that appearances could be masks. That sometimes the people praised the loudest are the ones who hide the darkest secrets. To a child, trust is not earned. It is given freely, and I, like any child, gave it without hesitation. School in those days was simple. Wooden desks, chalk squeaking across the board, the ringing of a brass bell that echoed down the street. I was quick with words, loved reading, and often lost myself in stories of saints and heroines. I dreamed of growing into someone brave, someone who would stand for goodness no matter the cost. I was young, full of hope, unaware that bravery would one day be demanded of me in ways I could never imagine. When I close my eyes, I can still see the evenings when our family gathered for supper. Plates of steaming food passed from hand to hand, voices overlapping, my father's laughter filling the room. My uncle sat at the table as if he were part of the household itself, included in every blessing, every prayer, every celebration. He would joke about my clumsy habits, patting me on the back when I spilled water, and everyone would laugh. To the world, it was harmless teasing. To me, it was attention, something I thought was affection. The truth is, in those years, I did not know how to tell the difference between safe affection and something else. Children don't. We see love in every gesture, trust in every smile, safety in every familiar face. I never imagined that trust could be sharpened into a weapon, that affection could be twisted into chains. But innocence has a way of blinding us. It paints the world in soft colors, shielding us from the sharp edges lurking underneath. That was the world I lived in as a child, gentle, warm, ordinary. A world where the worst thing I feared was a scolding for running barefoot outside, or the disappointment of a poor grade on a spelling test. I share these memories not to dwell on sweetness, but because they matter. They matter because they show how easily the ground beneath a child can crumble. They matter because they remind me, and perhaps remind you, that no one expects betrayal from the ones they are taught to trust most. Even now, all these years later, when I kneel in prayer, I sometimes picture that little girl I once was, carefree, humming hymns, believing the world was safe. She did not know what awaited her. She did not know that the same uncle who ruffled her hair, who carried her on his shoulders, who bowed his head in the pew beside her, would one day become the source of her silence. And it is that innocence, that blindness of trust, that makes the shattering all the more painful. For the most devastating betrayals never come from strangers in the dark. They come from the ones who sit at your table, who share your prayers, who kiss your forehead good night. I was a child, untouched by suspicion, untouched by fear, and because of that, I never saw the shadow slowly lengthening across my life until it was already upon me. It was an afternoon that seemed no different from countless others. The sun drifted lazily across the sky, spilling warm light into the kitchen where I was rinsing dishes. My parents had gone out, my mother to deliver some sewing to a neighbor, my father away on work as always. The house was quiet, except for the creak of the floorboards and the faint ticking of the clock that hung on the wall. My uncle was there. That was not unusual. He often stopped by under the pretense of helping with chores or checking on us when my parents were away. At first, I thought nothing of it. I was used to his presence, the way he filled a room with his confident voice, the way others seemed to relax around him. But that day, something in the air felt different, as if the silence carried a weight I could not name. He stood behind me, closer than before. I could feel his breath stir the hair at the back of my neck. My small hands trembled slightly as I tried to keep scrubbing a dish, but my heart thumped so loudly that it seemed to echo in my ears. "You're growing up so quickly," he said softly, his voice lower than usual. At that age, I didn't understand the undertone, but I felt it all the same, a chill that spread down my spine, making me wish the floor would open beneath me. I tried to laugh nervously, to step aside, but he reached out and caught my arm. His grip was not harsh, but it was firm enough to freeze me where I stood. "You know I care about you," he whispered. The words were ordinary on the surface, yet something about them felt wrong. Wrong in a way I could not put into words. When I turned, his eyes held a look I had never seen before, one that stripped away the comfort of family and replaced it with something that made me shrink inside. I pulled back instinctively. "Uncle, I should finish the dishes," I murmured, my voice barely audible, but he did not move away. His smile was not the smile I had grown up with, the one that made people laugh at family dinners. It was thinner, quieter, unsettling. The kitchen, once a place of warmth, suddenly felt like a cage. In that moment, though I did not fully understand what was happening, I knew one thing with certainty. Something precious was being taken from me. Not in the way one steals money or food, but in the way someone reaches into your heart and twists trust into fear. That day, my childhood began to crack. I do not need to describe the details, because the details are not what matter. What matters is the feeling, the paralyzing confusion, the desperate wish to run, and the sickening realization that the person you thought was safe is not safe at all. What matters is how silence became my shield, even as it turned into my prison. When it ended, I sat on the floor of my room with my knees pulled to my chest, my hands clutching my little wooden cross so tightly that it left marks in my palm. Tears slipped down my face, though I tried to choke them back. I told myself that maybe it was my imagination, that maybe I had misunderstood, that perhaps nothing truly wrong had happened. But deep inside, I knew better. The worst part was not the act itself, it was the voice that whispered afterward. "No one will believe you." It hissed inside my mind, growing louder with each heartbeat. "They'll say you made it up. They'll say you wanted attention. They'll never take your side against him." That whisper became a shadow that followed me everywhere. At school the next day, I tried to smile at my friends, but the smile felt cracked, like porcelain ready to break. My teacher asked me to read aloud from a book, and though the words were simple, my throat closed up. I stumbled, my voice faltering, and laughter rippled from the back of the class. They did not know that I wasn't stumbling over words. I was stumbling over the weight of a secret too heavy for a child to carry. At home, I avoided my uncle's gaze, but he was always near. When relatives visited, he acted the same as ever, laughing, helping, cracking jokes. No one saw what I saw. No one felt the invisible wall of fear that pressed against me each time he entered a room. I sat at the dinner table, listening to his voice fill the air, while my own stayed silent. That night, as I lay in bed, I prayed harder than I had ever prayed before. "God, please, please protect me. Please don't let this happen again." My small voice broke as I whispered into the dark. The wooden cross above my bed looked down at me, and for the first time I wondered if heaven was listening at all. Days passed, and the memory of that afternoon clung to me like a stain. It colored everything, my laughter, my prayers, even the way I saw my own reflection in the mirror. I no longer recognized the girl who stared back at me. She looked the same, but her eyes carried a shadow too heavy for her age. I did not speak of it. How could I? My parents were proud of my uncle, trusted him, leaned on him for help. If I opened my mouth, I feared the family would crumble, that I would be blamed, that I would be cast aside. So I did what many children in my place do. I swallowed my words and let silence settle into my bones. Looking back now, I can see how that moment was the first fracture. The beginning of years, where silence was both my shield and my curse. That day in the kitchen was the day my voice began to wither, replaced by a hollow echo that whispered, "Stay quiet. No one will believe you." If betrayal has a face, it is not the face of a stranger lurking in the shadows. It is the face of someone you know, someone you trusted, someone who smiled as they sat at your table. And when that trust is broken, it is not only innocence that is lost, it is the very sense of who you are. That afternoon was the beginning of my silence. And silence, once it takes root, does not easily let go. After that afternoon in the kitchen, my world did not collapse all at once. No walls came crashing down. No thunder roared in the sky. On the surface, life went on exactly as before. My parents laughed at the dinner table. Neighbors greeted me kindly in the street. Church bells rang with the same steady rhythm each Sunday. But inside me, something had shattered, and the pieces cut into me. Each day I stayed quiet. Silence was supposed to protect me. At least that was what I told myself. If I kept my mouth closed, if I smiled at the right moments, if I pretended nothing had happened, maybe everything could go back to normal. Maybe my uncle would forget. Maybe I could forget too. But silence does not erase pain. It feeds it. Each day that I swallowed the truth, it grew heavier, pressing against my chest until it felt like I could hardly breathe. He knew my silence. He counted on it. When no one else was watching, his eyes would find mine, carrying an unspoken warning. Don't you dare. Sometimes his hand would rest on my shoulder in front of others, looking affectionate to them, but sending icy terror through me. And I would sit frozen, forcing my lips into a polite smile, praying no one saw the fear in my eyes. At school, I drifted farther from the girl I used to be. Once I had been lively, eager to read aloud, quick to laugh at little jokes. Now my laughter was hollow, my voice quieter. Teachers called on me, but my answers stumbled. Friends asked why I seemed distracted, but I brushed them off with excuses. How could I explain that my thoughts were chained to a secret too dark for a child's tongue? At home, my parents noticed changes, though they misunderstood them. My mother would sigh, saying, "Vivian, you've grown moody." My father would frown when I refused to eat, assuming it was childish stubbornness. They did not see the storm behind my silence. And I did not tell them, because the voice inside me hissed that they would never believe me. That voice grew louder with each passing week. You're the one who will be blamed. You'll destroy your family. You'll shame your parents. These words did not come from my uncle's lips, but they might as well have. They were carved into me by fear, repeating until I could no longer separate my own thoughts from the poison he planted. Even in church, where I once found comfort, silence followed me like a shadow. I knelt in prayer, whispering, "Lord, please hear me." But my voice trembled, and the stained glass saints seemed distant. I wondered if God had turned his face away. I wondered if heaven stayed silent, because it was ashamed of me too. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, my little cross clutched in my hand, afraid of every creak of the floorboards. Sometimes I pressed my face into the pillow to muffle my sobs, terrified someone might hear. Other times, I bit my lip until it bled, just to keep from crying out. I told myself stories to survive. I imagined I was invisible, that if I stayed still and quiet enough, no one could see me. I pretended I was locked in a glass box, untouchable by the world outside. In my imagination, silence became armor, but in truth it was a cage. The walls of that cage grew taller every day until I could not see a way out. My uncle's power over me was not only in what he did, it was in what he made me fear. He convinced me that silence was my only choice. And so I lived two lives, the girl others saw, who smiled politely and folded her hands in prayer, and the girl hidden within, trembling, voiceless, chained. There were moments when the urge to speak clawed at me. I remember one Sunday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table as my mother hummed while kneading dough. My lips parted, the words hovering on the edge. "Mom, something is wrong. Mom, please listen." But before I could speak, the voice of fear returned, whispering, "If you say it, she will turn away from you. She will think you're lying. You'll lose everything." And so I closed my mouth again, forcing the words back down into the pit of silence. I grew smaller inside myself. My shoulders hunched as though trying to fold me inward, to make me disappear. My grades slipped, my laughter faded. Friends drifted away, unable to understand the wall I had built between us. Even my prayers shrank, no longer bold and innocent but desperate. Broken pleas whispered into the night. One evening, when the weight of silence felt unbearable, I whispered aloud to the shadows of my room, "Lord, if you see me, please send me a sign." My voice cracked on the last word. I waited, holding my breath, hoping for a miracle, a flicker of light, a voice, anything. But nothing happened. The silence remained, and I pressed my face into the pillow, convinced that even God had chosen not to hear me. That was the cruelest part of all. Silence not only trapped me with my uncle's shadow, it made me believe I was invisible to heaven itself. But though I did not know it then, the silence would not last forever. There would come a night when the walls I had built around myself would begin to crumble, when light would pierce through the cracks I thought were sealed. A miracle was waiting, though I could not yet see it, for now all I knew was silence. A silence so thick it drowned me, a silence I carried like a cross too heavy for my small shoulders. A silence that bound me tighter with every passing day. Silence does not vanish on its own. It grows heavier, pressing against the chest until every breath feels borrowed. By the time I reached my teenage years, the weight of what I carried had begun to leave marks not only on my soul, but on my body. My family thought I was simply changing with age, retreating into moodiness as many girls do. They did not see the battle inside me, the storm raging behind my downcast eyes. I stopped eating full meals. Food lost its taste. My stomach knotted whenever I tried to swallow. My once curly hair thinned, my skin grew pale. I often slipped into bed before nightfall, not from tiredness, but from the wish to disappear. Yet sleep gave me no peace. Nightmares returned again and again, his shadow in the doorway, the weight of his presence, the echo of his words. "Don't you dare tell." I would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding as though I had run a great distance. At school, my hands trembled when asked to write on the chalkboard. I stuttered when speaking in class. Teachers whispered about my sudden decline. Some pitied me. Others scolded me for failing to live up to my potential. None of them knew the reason my light had dimmed. Friends asked why I no longer joined their games, why I avoided even simple laughter. I made excuses, inventing headaches, pretending I needed to hurry home. The truth remained locked inside. My uncle's shadow still haunted me. Though he was not always present, the damage had already taken root. Even on days I did not see him, I carried him in my mind. His smirk, his grip, his whispered threats. They followed me into every corner of my life, reminding me that I was trapped. The strain began to break through in sudden moments. I fainted once while walking home from school, collapsing on the dusty road. A neighbor found me and rushed me back to the house where my mother fretted, thinking it was exhaustion or an empty stomach. She pressed broth to my lips, smoothing my hair, never suspecting the truth. Another time, I lashed out at a classmate who startled me by tapping my shoulder. My anger shocked me as much as it shocked them. I had never been a violent child, but fear had sharpened itself into a blade, cutting anyone who came too close. Inside, I begged for relief. I prayed desperately, "God, why won't you stop this?" Why do you let me carry this alone? My prayers felt like cries into a cavern that only threw the sound back to me. I began to wonder if silence was not only my prison, but God's too. The breaking point came one night after another argument at home. My father scolded me for slipping grades, his voice hard, his disappointment sharp. "You have every opportunity," he said. "Why are you wasting it?" My mother tried to defend me, but even her soft words could not erase the sting. I wanted to shout the truth, because I am drowning. Because the man you trust has broken me, but the words stuck in my throat, strangled by fear. That night, lying in bed, I pressed my pillow against my face to keep my sobs from being heard. My body shook so violently I thought I might tear apart. My heart pounded, my chest burned, and in my despair I whispered, "Lord, if you see me, please, please save me, or I will not survive this." It was not a graceful prayer. It was not wrapped in holy language or polished faith. It was raw, cracked, desperate, and though the room remained dark and silent, something inside me shifted. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, my silence would not last forever. The very next day, my body finally betrayed me. At school, as I walked toward the chalkboard, my vision blurred, my knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the wooden floor. Gasps filled the room. My teacher rushed forward, her hands cool on my forehead. When I awoke, I was in the infirmary, the nurse pressing water to my lips. Concern etched their faces in ways I had not seen before. For the first time, adults began to notice something was deeply wrong, but I still said nothing. Even in that moment of weakness, I clung to silence, convinced that telling the truth would destroy everything. What I did not know was that God was already setting in motion the miracle I had begged for, the moment when my secret would no longer remain hidden. At home, my parents worried more openly. My mother hovered at my bedside, smoothing my sheets, whispering, "You're scaring me, Vivian." My father grew quieter, watching me with a furrowed brow, as though struggling to reconcile the daughter before him with the girl he thought he knew. They asked questions, but I dodged them, offering half answers. I could not bring myself to say the words aloud. And still, the silence grew heavier. It pressed against me like a weight I could no longer bear. I longed to speak, to scream, to confess, but fear chained my tongue. The breaking point was near, though I did not yet see how close. Looking back, I realized that the fainting spells, the lost appetite, the hollow eyes, all of it was my body's way of crying for help when my mouth would not. My silence could no longer protect me. It was tearing me apart, and it was in the darkness of that breaking point that the light finally began to pierce through. A miracle was approaching, quiet at first, almost unseen, but powerful enough to change the course of my life forever. There are prayers we whisper believing no one hears them. We fold them into the dark, send them upward with trembling breath, and wait for silence to answer us back. For years that was my life, pleading into the void. But sometimes God answers in ways we do not expect. He sends miracles, not always wrapped in thunder or light, but in the quiet persistence of someone who notices what others ignore. My miracle began with a pair of watchful eyes. It was a teacher at school, a woman who had seen many children pass through her classroom. She noticed how I had changed. She saw the way my shoulders curved inward as if to shield myself from an invisible blow, the way my eyes darted when a door creaked, the way my laughter had vanished altogether. At first she said nothing, but she kept watching, and one day, when I fainted again in class, she held me close as if I were her own daughter and whispered, "You are safe with me." Those words broke something in me, not because I believed them right away, but because they were the first to contradict the voice of fear that told me I was utterly alone. The questions came gently at first. She asked if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping well, if things were peaceful at home. I shook my head, nodded, mumbled vague replies. But she did not stop asking, and when she caught me trembling at the mention of my uncle, she paused, her eyes narrowing in realization. I will never forget the day she asked me directly. The classroom was empty, the last rays of sunlight slipping across the floor. She knelt down so her face was level with mine and said softly, "Vivian, is someone hurting you?" For a long moment I could not breathe. My lips parted, but the words refused to form. Tears welled in my eyes and spilled down my cheeks. She reached for my hands and held them firmly, refusing to let me hide. "It's all right," she said. "You don't have to carry this alone." And in that moment, the silence cracked. Not all at once, not in a torrent of words, but in a trembling nod, a sob that seemed to rise from the deepest pit of my chest. She did not demand details. She simply promised, "We will help you. You are not alone anymore." The next hours are a blur in my memory. There were hushed phone calls, my mother's hurried footsteps, the confusion in my father's eyes as he tried to understand. The truth began to leak out, piece by piece, like light seeping through cracks in a shuttered room. At first, they did not believe. I could see it in their faces, the disbelief, the anger, the desperate hope that what I suggested could not possibly be true. How could it be when the man in question was their own flesh and blood? But denial could not erase the trembling in my body, the sickness that had consumed me, the words my teacher had already confirmed. Eventually the truth settled like ash, and there was no sweeping it away. My father's face hardened in rage. My mother broke down in sobs that shook the walls. And my uncle, when confronted, denied it all with a fury that only deepened the cracks in our family, neighbors whispered. Some pitied me, others doubted me. A few looked at me with eyes that seemed to say, "Why did you speak at all?" But I could not retreat into silence again. Once broken, the chains would not hold. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also freedom. For the first time, the secret was no longer mine alone to bear. The shadow that had followed me was dragged into the light, kicking and screaming. And though my family fractured, though the storm of conflict nearly tore us apart, I knew deep down that a miracle had arrived. It was not the miracle I had prayed for as a child. I had begged for escape, for protection, for God to make it stop. Instead, He sent me someone who saw me when no one else did. Someone who dared to ask the question others avoided. That was the miracle. Not deliverance in an instant, but the presence of a voice that told me I was not invisible. The nights after the truth came out were restless. Arguments echoed through our home. My father raged, my mother wept, relatives took sides. Yet in the midst of chaos, I felt a strange new strength. The silence had ended. My words, shaking, broken, incomplete, had finally escaped the prison I once thought was unbreakable. I remember lying awake one night, clutching my cross as I always had, but this time whispering, "Thank you." My voice was still fragile, but it carried gratitude. Not because the pain was gone, it wasn't, but because the truth was finally known. And truth, once spoken, becomes its own kind of salvation. Looking back, I see that moment as the turning point. The miracle was not in erasing what had happened. It was in giving me the courage and the help to face it. It was in the people God placed in my path, a teacher who refused to ignore, a mother who eventually held me through her tears, and a Father in heaven who, though silent for so long, had not abandoned me after all. That was the beginning of rescue. The beginning of a life no longer chained by silence. When the silence broke, I imagined freedom would rush in like a flood. I thought once the truth was spoken, the burden would lift, and I would finally be able to breathe. But the truth does not heal instantly. It exposes, it divides, it unsettles everything that once seemed steady. My words, fragile though they were, cracked open my family like glass. The pieces scattered in every direction, sharp and impossible to hold together again. At first, there was anger, loud, fierce, uncontrollable. My father's voice rose higher than I had ever heard, shaking the very walls of our house. His hands, once steady and strong, trembled with rage as he shouted my uncle's name. My mother wept in corners, torn between disbelief and devastation. Some relatives refused to believe me, saying I must have misunderstood, that children exaggerate, that I had been influenced. Their words sliced into me like knives, confirming the fear that had long kept me silent. No one will believe you, and yet there were others who looked at me and saw what I carried, the hollow in my eyes, the sickness in my body. They could not deny what truth had already done to me. My uncle denied it all, of course. His face twisted with fury when confronted. "She's lying," he spat. "She wants attention." To the outside world, he still wore the mask of a generous man, dependable and charming. Some clung to that mask, desperate not to admit what lurked behind it. For to believe me meant reimagining every family dinner, every laugh, every prayer shared in his presence. To believe me meant acknowledging that evil had lived inside their own home. The days that followed were chaos. Conversations turned into arguments, arguments into silence. The phone rang with voices demanding answers. Neighbors whispered when we walked to church. I felt exposed, as though the entire world could see my brokenness. My parents tried to shield me, but even they were unraveling. My father's anger burned so brightly that it left no room for tenderness. My mother's grief consumed her, leaving her eyes swollen and her body weary. They loved me, I know they did, but they did not know how to love me through this. In the midst of it all, I felt guilty. Guilty for speaking, guilty for tearing open wounds, guilty for the cracks that widened with every day that passed. I told myself, if I had stayed silent, none of this would have happened. It was the lie I had carried for years, resurfacing even after truth had been spoken. The burden shifted, but it did not disappear. Family gatherings, once warm and filled with laughter, vanished altogether. Some relatives turned cold, keeping their distance, as if my pain might infect them. Others hovered with pity, speaking in hushed tones when I entered the room. I no longer belonged in the family as I once did. I had become both victim and reminder, a living proof of betrayal. The church became complicated too. Faith had always been my refuge, but now it was tangled in questions. Some in the parish offered compassion, bringing meals, whispering prayers for my strength. But others turned their eyes away, uncomfortable with the reality that one of their own had harmed me. Even in the house of God, I felt divided between those who believed and those who doubted. I longed for normalcy, for the days when my laughter was unforced, when I could sit at a family table without tension pressing down on every word. But those days were gone. In their place was a new life, truth exposed, but peace nowhere to be found. I withdrew further into myself. I stopped visiting certain relatives, avoided gatherings altogether. My friends at school looked at me differently too. Some offered comfort, but most drifted away, unsure of what to say. I became the girl with the story no one wanted to talk about, the girl marked by scandal. There were nights when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, asking God, why did you let it come to this? Why does the truth hurt almost as much as the silence? The heavens gave no answer. Yet even in my questioning, I clung to the small flicker of hope that had been kindled when my secret first slipped out. At least I was no longer carrying it alone. Still, the family I once knew never returned. My father's relationship with his brother shattered completely. Words were said that could never be unsaid, lines drawn that could never be crossed again. My mother aged in those years, her hair turning gray faster than it should have, her eyes weary from the weight of grief. And I, though I was young, felt older than my years, as though my childhood had been stripped away and replaced with ashes. The uncle who had once sat at our table was gone, cast out from our home. Yet his shadow lingered. His absence did not erase the damage, it only made the silence louder. I still heard his voice in my head, still felt the weight of his threats. Even without him present, he remained a ghost in every corner of my life. Looking back, I see that the aftermath was its own kind of prison. The silence was broken, yes, but in its place came division, doubt, and wounds that no one knew how to heal. I had imagined that truth would set me free. Instead, it left me standing in the ruins of a family torn apart. But I also see now that even in those ruins, God was at work. Because sometimes healing cannot begin until everything false has been stripped away. And though I did not recognize it then, the shattered pieces of my family became the very path that led me to the refuge I would one day find. The walls of the convent. The arms of faith, the slow and painful journey toward peace. At that time, however, all I felt was loss. The loss of innocence, the loss of trust, the loss of the family I thought would always protect me. And though the miracle of discovery had begun to change my life, it also demanded a price. The life I had known was gone, replaced by one that would forever carry scars. After the storm that tore my family apart, I longed for somewhere to hide. The world around me felt unsafe, my own home a battlefield of grief and anger. My father, though furious at my uncle, carried his rage like a fire that burned everyone near him. My mother wept often, her sorrow seeping into every corner of our lives. Relatives avoided us, neighbors whispered, and I felt as though every eye carried a question I could not answer. I needed refuge. I needed silence that was not a prison, but a sanctuary. That search for refuge is what led me toward the convent. It began with small steps. My teacher, the same woman who had first noticed my suffering, encouraged me to join a youth group at the church. There, I met women in black habits who carried themselves with a peace I did not understand. Their voices were calm, their hands busy with prayer beads, their eyes steady and kind. Unlike the world outside, which judged and whispered, they welcomed me without questions. They did not demand explanations for my silence. They simply offered presence. One sister in particular took me under her wing. She saw the way I lingered at the edges, hesitant to step inside. She invited me to sit beside her during Vespers, teaching me the rhythm of chants that felt older than time itself. Her patience drew me in. And in the quiet of those gatherings, I began to sense something I had thought lost, the faint warmth of God's nearness. For the first time in years, silence was not heavy. In the chapel, silence was holy. The flicker of candles did not remind me of shadows, but of light pushing back the dark. I would sit for hours, watching wax drip down, breathing in the scent of incense, and feel a calmness settle over me. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed my fear, leaving me lighter each time I walked out. As the months passed, the idea of entering the convent no longer seemed distant. It became a possibility, then a calling. I wanted the safety of those walls, the rhythm of prayer, the distance from the pain that clung to my family. When I told my parents, my mother looked both surprised and relieved. "Maybe it's what you need," she said softly. My father, though hesitant, agreed when he saw the spark of peace it brought me. The decision was not simple. It meant leaving behind friends, family, even the hope of the life I once imagined for myself. But by then I no longer dreamed of the ordinary. Marriage, children, a home filled with laughter, those were visions that seemed out of reach. What I wanted was peace. What I wanted was to belong somewhere safe. The day I stepped through the gates of the convent as a novice, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief because I knew I was closing the door on one life forever. Relief because perhaps I was finally stepping into the arms of something greater than myself. Life in the convent was not easy. The days began before sunrise, filled with prayer, chores, study, and silence. Yet that silence was different from the one I had known in childhood. It did not suffocate me. It shaped me. It gave structure to my days, guiding me toward a God who, though I had once doubted him, was slowly stitching my wounds together. I learned to scrub floors until they shone, to tend gardens that fed the sisters, to care for the elderly in our parish. With every act of service, I felt pieces of myself being rebuilt. My hands, once trembling with fear, now found strength in simple tasks. My voice, once stolen by silence, began to return in hymns sung softly at dawn. And yet, even within the convent walls, the past followed me. Nightmares did not vanish overnight. There were evenings when I knelt in the chapel long after the others had gone to bed, whispering prayers through tears I could not stop. The shadow of my uncle lingered, reminding me that healing was not a straight path, but I was no longer carrying the burden alone. The sisters, though they did not always know the details, carried me in prayer. One evening, when I could no longer hide my trembling hands, the elder sister placed hers over mine and said, "You are safe here, child." Those words, so simple, felt like another miracle. Faith became not just refuge, but transformation. I began to understand that God had not abandoned me in my childhood. He had been there in the silence, weeping with me, waiting for the day I would find the courage to speak. The convent did not erase my past, but it gave me tools to face it: prayer, discipline, and a community that loved me not for what I had endured, but for who I was becoming. I often thought back to the girl I once was, the child clutching her cross in the dark, begging for a sign. I wished I could reach through time and tell her, "Hold on, the sign will come. The refuge you long for is real." Joining the convent did not end my story. It was only the beginning of another chapter, one where I would slowly learn that healing takes years, that scars never vanish, but can become reminders of survival. But stepping into that life was the first true escape. The first time I felt the chains of my past loosen just enough to breathe. I had entered the convent not only to serve God, but to hide from the world that had broken me. Yet in hiding, I discovered something I had not expected, that God would one day call me not to stay hidden, but to share my story so that others trapped in silence might find courage too. For now, though, I was simply grateful. Grateful for walls that sheltered me, for voices that prayed with me, for a God who turned my silence into sanctuary. Life inside the convent gave me refuge, but refuge is not the same as freedom. The walls kept me safe from the outside world, yet they could not keep away the shadows of my past. No matter how tightly I laced my habit, no matter how many hours I spent in prayer, the memories followed me. Healing is not a single moment. It is a journey, one with turns, stumbles, and nights so long that dawn feels like a distant dream. At first, I thought the rhythm of convent life would erase everything. We woke before sunrise, our voices rising together in hymns as the first light pierced the horizon. We worked with our hands, cooking, cleaning, tending to the sick and the poor. We spent hours in silence, meditating on the Word. From the outside, it seemed a life untouched by the world's pain. But inside, I carried my own battlefield. There were nights when I woke gasping, the echo of my uncle's voice clawing me out of sleep. I would kneel on the cold stone floor, clutching my rosary, whispering prayers until dawn. The sisters never scolded me for missing sleep. Some mornings, they simply placed an extra cup of tea before me at breakfast, their eyes saying what their lips did not: "We know you are fighting." Over time, I learned that healing did not mean forgetting. The past could not be erased, but it could be transformed. My pain became the very thing that gave me compassion. When I sat beside a young girl in confession, trembling as she whispered her own secrets, I recognized the fear in her eyes. I leaned closer, told her softly, "You are not alone. God sees you." In comforting her, I was also comforting the child I had once been. The sisters taught me patience, not the shallow patience of waiting in line, but the deep patience of letting wounds close in their own time. You cannot force a flower to bloom by pulling on its petals, one elder sister told me as we worked in the garden. It opens when it is ready. Her words stayed with me. For years I had begged God to take away my scars instantly, but slowly I realized that healing was a bloom that unfolded one fragile petal at a time. Still, there were setbacks. Days when old guilt surged, whispering that I had destroyed my family by speaking out. Nights when shame convinced me I was unworthy of God's love. There were even times when I questioned whether the convent was truly my calling, or whether I had run here simply to escape the world. Yet even in doubt, the rhythm of prayer pulled me forward. Each day was a reminder that faith is not about never questioning. It is about clinging to God, even when the questions feel heavier than the answers. One of the most difficult lessons I learned was forgiveness. Not the easy forgiveness we speak about lightly, but the kind that feels impossible. For a long time I told myself I could never forgive my uncle. To forgive, I thought, would mean excusing what he had done. But forgiveness is not forgetting, nor is it acceptance of evil. Forgiveness is releasing the hold the past has on your soul. Slowly, through years of prayer, I began to lay down that weight. Not for him, but for me, because carrying hatred was another chain, and I was tired of chains. There came a moment, years later, when I realized I had changed. A young girl was brought to the convent, bruised by her own life's storms. She would not speak to anyone, sitting in corners with her eyes on the ground. Something in her reminded me of myself at that age. One evening, I sat beside her in silence, neither of us saying a word. After a long while, she whispered, "Do you think God still loves me?" My throat tightened, tears filled my eyes, and I took her hand gently. "Yes," I told her. "He loves you even in the silence, especially in the silence." In that moment, I knew. My pain had not been in vain. The girl who had once been silenced was now learning to give others a voice. My scars had become a lantern, not a chain. The convent gave me tools I never had as a child: structure, prayer, sisterhood. But more than that, it gave me purpose. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a servant, a witness, a reminder to others that darkness does not have the final word. Each time I comforted someone else, a piece of my own heart healed. Each time I stood in prayer with my sisters, I felt less like a victim and more like a vessel for grace. Looking back, those years of wrestling with shadows were some of the hardest of my life, but also the most transformative. I learned that healing is not the absence of scars. It is the ability to live with them, to let them tell a story of survival rather than defeat. I learned that God's silence was never abandonment. It was patience, waiting for the moment I was ready to hear His answer. And I learned that even the darkest memories can be reshaped into compassion for others. The girl who once cowered in silence was gone. In her place stood a woman who could look into another's eyes and say with conviction, "You are not alone." That was the miracle of my convent years. Not that the shadows disappeared, but that I no longer faced them by myself. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. The scars remain, yes, but they no longer bleed as they once did. When I look back now, from the quiet halls of the convent where I have spent much of my life, I see not only the pain but the journey, the long, winding path from silence to voice, from fear to faith, from brokenness to something resembling wholeness. For many years, I believed my life would be defined only by what was taken from me. I thought I would forever be the child trapped in a kitchen, trembling beneath the shadow of someone who should have protected me. But God has a way of writing endings we cannot imagine in the midst of our suffering. What felt like ruin became the soil where resilience grew. I speak these words now, not as the frightened girl I once was, but as a woman who has lived through storms and found light on the other side. My name is still Vivian Caraway, and yes, I am a nun. But I am also something more. I am a survivor. a witness to the truth that even silence can be broken. Even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. Telling this story has not been easy. Each memory carries its own weight. Each word feels like reopening an old scar. But I have learned that testimony itself is a form of healing. For years, my silence nearly destroyed me. Now my voice is my redemption. In speaking, I refuse to let darkness have the final word. I know there are others, many others, who carry secrets like mine. Some are children still, clinging to pillows in the night, praying for a sign that they are not forgotten. Others are adults who have carried their silence into middle age, believing it is too late to speak. To each one I say this: silence does not protect you, it binds you, and breaking it may feel like death at first, but it is the beginning of life. My journey has not been without struggle. Even here, within the convent walls, there are nights when I wake with tears on my cheeks, echoes of the past haunting me. But now I no longer face them alone. My sisters pray with me, stand beside me, remind me that my worth was never destroyed by what happened to me. And my God, whom I once thought had abandoned me, has proven faithful in ways I never expected. He did not erase my past, but He walked me through it. The miracle that saved me was not thunder in the sky, nor an angel descending with fire. It was a teacher's steady gaze, a question asked at the right time, a hand held when mine was trembling. It was my family, fractured though it became, finally seeing the truth. It was the sisters of this convent who welcomed me when I had nowhere else to go. It was the quiet, persistent love of God who never stopped listening, even when I thought He had turned away. I often speak with young women who come to the convent seeking refuge. Many of them carry wounds of their own, different stories, but the same heavy silence. I tell them what I once longed to hear. You are not invisible. You are not unlovable. God sees you, and there is life beyond this pain. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they simply nod. But always, I see a flicker of hope in their eyes. And in giving them hope, I find my own hope renewed. If you are listening to my story, wondering whether healing is possible for you, let me be clear. It is. It may take years. It may feel impossible. It may require breaking everything open before you can rebuild. But scars are not signs of failure. They are signs of survival. And survival is the seed of healing. I will never claim that my life became perfect. The past cannot be erased, and there are days when the weight of memory still presses against me. But I can tell you this: the girl who was silenced has found her voice. The child who thought she was abandoned has discovered she was held all along. The woman who once trembled in the dark now stands in the light, not because she is stronger than others, but because grace carried her when she could not carry herself. As I close this chapter of my confession, I do so with a prayer, not just for myself, but for all who have known silence like mine. May you find the courage to speak. May you find the people who will listen. May you discover that miracles are often found in the gentlest places. And may you come to know, as I have, that silence is not the end of your story. I survived. I healed, and now I speak. Not for pity, not for revenge, but for truth. For the girl I once was, for the women and men who still live in shadows, and for the God who turned my silence into testimony. This is my story. The story of betrayal, silence, and the miracle that saved me. The story of Vivian Caraway, not defined by pain, but redeemed through grace.